Hello and welcome to this lecture in our section on metaphysics. This week, at least this first lecture, I'm going to be discussing the nature of time and a little bit about space, at least some philosophical thinking about these things, particularly having to do with, the metaphysics of time, like the nature of time. What is time? Um, Hopefully you've looked at the readings. So the readings for this week are, at least, or for this lecture, are, or the main reading is just the Stanford Encyclopedia article on philosophy of time. And then there's also the McTaggart article, which the Stanford article focuses on as well. So what is time? Well, there's two sort of general views about the nature of time, like answering the question of what it is, if it's a thing at all. The two views kind of go like this. One view is the view that time is just all of the events that happen, ever, right? And what time is just the nature of change from one event to another. So on this view, all of time is just instances of change and sort of, in a sense, like the distance between change, right? That's a period of time is the distance from one, it's not really a length, right? It's not distance in that sense. It's the distance in time between one change and the next. One way of thinking about this view of time is that if things were to just sort of stand still, like perfectly still, um, there would be no change in time, right? So this thought is like, if everything froze, then time would be standing still and would not be moving. There would be no time if everything wasn't, in some sense or another, shifting or changing in some way. On the other hand, though, there's the other view of time is that time is a real thing, and that it's kind of like the container of all of the events. So on this view, there's this, it's the thought that the time is real, and it's like, and it has a set cadence. It kind of goes at a specific speed or something like that, and events happen within time. On this view, time is its own thing apart from the events, but the events occur within time. And the sort of way to distinguish this view of time from the other view of time is the thought that if everything in the entire universe were at some point to freeze, if everything froze, freeze frame, right, like in a cartoon or something, would it make sense for there to be a period of time between when the thing when time froze and when it unfroze? So like, imagine, in the middle of the sentence that I'm saying right now, time stopped for 1,000,000 years, right? I mean, not time, but everything in the universe stopped. Like it just ceased to move, and then picked right back up, and none of us noticed it, right? None of us noticed that because it was a freeze. So it's kind of like one of those, like, the time travel or time stoppage movies, right? Somebody has a remote and they can stop time, they can freeze time. What are they doing? Are they freezing time? Well, clearly not, right? Because time is still going for them, but they're freezing, something like the events that are happening within time. So, two different views. On one view, it makes sense to say that if everything freezes, that time is still going on. That's the time is real view. And on the other view, it's to say that no, time just is what it is for things to change over it, right? Time just is, movement over time, or, you can't say movement over time. Time just is the happenings of things. Now, these two views of time, in a sense, match two different views of space that people have had at different points in time. And you can kind of, if you're having trouble visualizing these two views of time, because time's hard to talk about in temporal terms, right? It's easier to visualize spatial relations. You can think about space along these lines too. So one view of space is that space is understood just as the distance between things. So there are things in different distance, like, at different distances from one another. And what space is sort of just the area between. It's the distance between one thing and another thing. And then, in a sense, once you get to the outer edge of space, there's just nothing. There's nothing out there. That isn't space. There is no space because there isn't, because, or there is no space on the outer edge, because there's nothing for it to be, the space between. Um, that's one view of the nature of space. It actually is probably the most currently widely held view of the nature of space, because, on the theory of relativity put forward by Einstein, space and time come into existence together as one thing, space-time. The other view of space, I think, is a little bit more intuitive, at least initially, even if it's wrong. And that's the view that space is a real thing. And it's kind of like a giant empty bucket. I mean, it's an infinitely vast empty bucket, but the idea is that space itself is this empty bucket and stuff is in the empty bucket, right? Like, things exist in space, and space is just this, void, this everlasting void. And there's no, space by itself. We can understand distance between points in space, but even if there weren't any things, there could still be space, right? There could be a giant empty space, and nothing could, if nothing existed, there could still be space in a sense, right? That's another view of, and these two views match up with the views of time, right? So the view that time is just, the duration between events, is similar to the idea that space is just the distance between things, and the view that time is this real thing in which events happen is akin to the view that space is this real, void in which things are. Here's, for your enjoyment, my a good time meme. Aristotle definitely thought time was real. Kant, I wouldn't say he thought that the time was an illusion of the mind, but he definitely thought that whatever time was, it was something that was imported by the mind onto whatever the universe is made up of. And then Marx, hopefully you've heard of Marxism or socialism in some way. Marx thought that, there was class struggle, and the bourgeoisie were bringing the proletariat down by doing things like inventing holidays. So maybe time was invented by the clock companies. All right, so this brings us to two sort of other ways of thinking about time, namely those brought into, sort of argued about by McTaggart. And so McTaggart was this interesting philosopher, and he had this view that time isn't real. The classic paper that he wrote that everybody reads nowadays is called The Unreality of Time. And he, in order to sort of get this across, he gives two sort of different theories of what time could be. So think about this, right? Think about properties of time. What kind of properties? What are temporal properties? Temporal properties of events. And the first thing that McTaggart sort of suggests is like, okay, well, let's take this series. He calls it the A series, where we've got, a timeline where T1 occurs, and then, time goes on, and then T2 occurs, and then time goes on, and T3 occurs. T1, 2, and 3 each being a separate, time for an event. Now, suppose that T2 is the present, right? It's the present moment. It's now. Well, if T2 is now, then that means that T1 is a time that was in the past. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. T2 is now, right? This present moment. And T3 is, sometime in the future, let's say 2 days, when at this point, when we actually know who won the election, hopefully. I'm recording this before, the election is, actually it's on election day. So that's, those are some properties of time, right? You take a period, a moment in time, and you can say, oh, okay, well, T1, okay, this is a past moment of time. T2, well, that's now, that's a current moment of time. And T3, oh, that's a future moment of time. It seems like, plausible to have these kinds of times, and that events at different times can have these properties of being past, being present, and being future. Well, McTaggart also thinks like, okay, so yeah, so that's one way of thinking about time, that you've got these like instances of time, and they have these properties, these basic properties, right? One property is past, it's in the past, right? It's just this property of being past. There's this other time T2 that has this property of being now. And then there's third property. There's time T3 that has the property of being in the future, and those are just properties simplicator, right? Right now, 2 days from now is just in the future. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and T1 is just in the past. No ifs, ands, buts about it. Well, there's another way of thinking about time, and it's by thinking about it more like this, right? So talk about the past and the present and the future. We can think about time in terms of relations between times, right? So take T1 and T2, or take T1, T2, and T3, take the same timeline, and think about what it means. Like, basically, the thought is this: we can get rid of talk about past, present, and future by talking instead about the relationships that certain times stand in to one another. So we'll just take all of the times and think about, actually, like, think about what it means to say that one is related to one another. So instead of talking about T1 as a past time, right? Instead of saying, oh, T1 is past, we can understand T1's pastness by thinking about T1 as being before T2 and T3, right? T1 was, and so we can think of, this temporal event as always standing in this relation to these other events, right? T1 is always before T2 and T3. And so because T1 is before T2 and T3, if T2 is now, then T1 is in the past. And so we understand the past in terms of the relationship that it stands in to other periods of time. We can also understand, similarly, T2 as being between T1 and T3. And so now we know, that T1 happened after, or T2 happened after T1, but T2 happened before T3. Similarly, T3 can happen after T1 and T2. And so if we know that, T2 is now, then we know that T3 is in the future. And so we can understand, or basically reduce, our talk about these things to talk about when things are, right? Like, we can about like where things are on the timeline in relation to one another. And so, the B series way of thinking about time is to say, no, look, times don't have these standalone properties, like of being past, being present, and being in the future. No, times, what they do is they stand in relation to one another. They stand in relation to, the one before them and the one after them. And that's just how time works. Every time that there is, every temporal instant that there is, can be understood in terms of the relations that it stands into each other time. And that's how we should think about time, instead of thinking about time in terms of, the instants that are past, present, and future. So all time on this view is reduced to relations between events, right? The relations that hold between times that happened before, after, and at the same time as. All right, well, McTaggart thinks the B series in the end can't really get us an adequate theory of time. So he postulates both the A and the B series, and he says, well, okay, his whole argument, remember, McTaggart's argument in the end is aiming at arguing that time is unreal. It's not even a real thing. So first of all, he says, well, here's two theories of time that he thinks, you know, all theories of time have to be one way or the other, in a sense. They have to either be A series theories or B series theories. So the B series, he thinks, in the end, after he's given it, after he's explained it, he thinks, well, actually, the B series, it can't handle time. So here's the idea. Suppose that time is constituted by the B series. That is, all of time is reduced to temporal relations between events. But McTaggart thinks it's in the nature of time itself for there to be change. That is, things change over time, and what time it is changes. That is, the present moment shifts from moment to moment. Right now, this moment is present. Right now, the previous moment is past, and this moment is present. Right now, this moment is present, right? In the future, the next moment will be present. But on the B series, there is no change over time, right? All temporal properties are ultimately fixed because they're just reduced to a kind of relation to one another, right? Each temporal time or event is fixed. It's either before or it's after one of the other ones, and or at the same time as, and there isn't really, any other way of thinking about things on B series terms. If all of time is to be understood in terms of whether or not it's before or after each event is before some or after some other event, then these things are all permanently fixed. There's nothing sort of shifty about them. It's not the case that any of these times is somehow special. None of these times is the present, really, or really, we can't think of each of these times as changing from present to non-present, because that's that doesn't that change that doesn't that we can't really capture that in terms of before and after terms, right? So according to McTaggart, the B series can't adequately explain time because it can't adequately explain how time changes and how from moment to moment we have a different present time, and how time goes from present to past and future to present to past. So that seems like a big problem for the B series. Well, okay, so supposing that the B series is wrong, McTaggart returns to the A series, and then he's going to try and argue that the A series is actually itself contradictory. So McTaggart thinks, okay, look, we need time to an adequate explanation of time needs to explain change, and time itself involves change. So the A series must be how time works, right? We've got T1, T2, T3. T2 is the present. That's what makes it before T3, a time that's in the future, and T1 in the past. And at one point T1 was in the past, and right now T2 is the present. I mean, at one point T1 in the past was the present, and now T2 is the present. At some point in the future, T3 will be the present, but right now it's not, right? Okay, so wait a minute though. When we say that, when it was time T1 was in the present, right? So when it was time T1, it was true to say T1 is the present. But it's also true to say now T1 is past. Well, what's true? Is it true that T1 is present, or is it true that T1 is past? I mean, before T1, it seems that T1 is the future. But wait, so now is T1 the present, or is T1 the future, or is T1 the past, like the way we set it up? Um, let's bring this out a little bit more clearly. Here, each of these things seems to be true. If a time t is in the past, then it cannot be in the present or the future. If a time t is in the present, then it cannot be in the past or in the future. And if a time t is in the future, then it cannot be in the past or in the present. But wait a minute. The property of being past and present seem to apply to T1. Because at one point, T1 was the present. And at another point, T1 was the past. But that seems like it conflicts with 1 and 2, right? It can't be that if something is in the past, that it's in the present. And it can't be that if it's in the present, that it's in the past. But the same issue here is going to go for all times T1 through T3. And all times other than that, even beyond that. So it seems like we have some kind of contradiction here, right? If we think about the times on their own, and we think about them as having these standalone properties, then it doesn't make sense to say, well, T1 had had the property of being in the present, or maybe it does. According to McTaggart, time must be in the A series. So McTaggart's argument in the end is basically something like this. Time has to be in the A series. That is, it has to be the case that moments of time are past and present and future. Otherwise, we don't have change. We don't have times changing from one time to the next. We don't have the present changing from one time to the next. So, the B series has got to be out. It can't be that time works like the B series says, because the B series can't handle change. However, the A series requires that all moments of time have the properties of being past, present, and future. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense to say that, the present time will eventually be past, and that the future time will eventually be present, and that the past time was at one time present or was at one time future. But the problem here is that this creates, according to McTaggart, a contradiction, because no moment of time, no event can have all three properties of being past, present, and future. Because we know that no past moment is present or future, and no present moment is past or future, and no future moment is past or present. So what gives if he thinks then, given this, that time has to be in the A series, A series requires, A series moments of time have these properties being past, present, and future, and no moment of time can both be past, present, and future at the same time, because if that makes sense, then time must not be real upon, contradiction. Time must be something like an illusion. There must just be an illusion of time, and time really can't be the way that he thinks it is. Now, there's a sort of simple response here, and maybe you picked up on it, because it's really hard to sort of even explain McTaggart's argument without kind of stumbling into the response. But I want to explain the response by re-explaining McTaggart's argument against the A series, and then sort of why he thinks that the response doesn't work. So remember, the A series says that moments of time are past, present, and future. And that is that they just have these standalone properties. So time T1 is, is in the past right now, because it's, because right now is time T2. But time T1 was, time T1 was present when time T1 was present, right? When it was now. and time t1 was future before time t1. So, but wait, okay. So, but wait a minute. The way that I'm saying these things is true, and the reason that I'm saying these things is true is because I'm taking tense seriously. That is, we need to take tense seriously. The A theorist response is to say, hey, McTaggart, wait a minute. It's not the case that, a moment of time is sort of tenselessly past, present, and future, all at once, in a sense. It's that, what we add tense. We say that a moment of time is present, was past, and will be future, right? So like, if a moment is in the future, it will be the present in the future. If a moment of time is past, then it was past, and it was present in the past. So, why can't we just use tense here to say these things about the moments of time and the properties that they have? Why can't we say, look, T1 was the present once, but it's not now the present, right? The difference there being that it was present and isn't now present. So we've got the was of the past tense and the is of the present tense. And we can say that T2 is present, the is of the present tense, but that T2 was in the future, right? In the past, T2 was in the future. We've got the past tense of was, and we can say that T2 will be in the past, right? In the future, T2 will be in the past. That is the future tense of will be. And finally, we can say T3 is in the future currently, right? That's the is of now, the is of the present. But it will be present. That is, in the future, it will be present. We've got the will be of the future tense, and eventually it will be past. Again, the will be of the future tense. And these all seem to be true, right? So what's the problem? Why doesn't this solve the problem? Why is the A theorist still, stuck, according to McTaggart? Well, McTaggart thinks that this begs the question. And remember, if we talked about begging the question, I think, or at least we talked about regresses earlier in this class. Basically, in order to take tense seriously, that is, in order to use this sort of move that the A theorist makes about tense, then we have to appeal to times. And we can't do that if we're trying to explain times. So here's the idea. You can't understand a tense without appeal to a time. To say that T1 was present, that time T1 was present, is to say that anytime after T1, T1 is no longer present. It is past, right? And that's what it means to say that T1 was present, right? It means to say that T1 happened and times occurred after T1, and because times occurred after T1, that T1 is no longer present. It's the past. But in order to say all of this, we have to assume that time passes and that instants of time change, and that things change. That what the present moment is changes over time. But that's what we were trying to figure out in the first place, right? That's what the A series was supposed to explain. The A series was supposed to tell us how time was, that it had these properties, these properties of being past, future, and present. And so you can't appeal to properties of time in order to solve the problem here, because that would create a regress. You can't appeal to so let me reiterate this. The A theory says there are times that are past, present, and future, and then McTaggart says that's a problem, that's a contradiction. You can't have a time that is both past and present and future at the same time, right? And then the A theorist says, wait a minute. What I was saying is that there's a time and it's the present now, but it was in the past. When it gets into the past, it will have been and it was, or let me put it this way: there's a time that's in the present. Any time that's in the past, was at one point in the present, and any time that will be, any time in the future is a time that will be in the present at some point. And McTaggart responds, wait a minute, when you're using tense, you can only understand that tense by appealing to the passage of time and understanding how time can be in the past, in the present, and in the future. How moments in time can be past, present, or future. And that's just, a non-starter. You can't try to explain how this works by appealing to some, like, by assuming that it works this way. So, in a way, you just, it's hard to get around McTaggart's argument here. It's if you try it for yourself, try thinking about explaining how time works without using temporal language. And if you try to do that, like, that is, if you try to use, explain how time works without using tensed words, that is, words that are in past tense or present tense or future tense. I mean, not present tense is fine, but past tense or future tense, you're just going to run into problems. And so, I don't know, McTaggart's argument, while it seems absurd to think that, time is unreal, it seems really interestingly tricky to explain what time is. So, there's got to be some other responses, and this is people have gone the gamut, right, of trying to give other responses, some of which go back to the B theory and say, hey, actually the B theory is going to work, and others try to sort of re-explain the A theory in different ways, showing how it could work. So here's one other way one might respond to McTaggart, right? And we'll talk about a couple of different ways here. You might think time is real, but its properties work rather differently than regular properties, right? It's not like, when a ball is red, right? The ball has the property of being red. Or when the table is hard, it's like, there's the table has the property of being hard. Those are physical properties. Those are real things out there in the world. Maybe it's the case that time is real, but it has, the properties of being past, present, and future are really very different. Past, present, and future on this idea are properties of events, not in relation to one another, as the B series suggests, but in relation to the whole of time. So think about it like this. Think about it in the spatial, under the spatial analogy. Imagine you've got a line, and on this line, you are in the middle of it, and you're facing one of the ends of the line, and then there's the other end of the line is behind you. Well, if it makes, like, how does it make sense, right? Each point of the line, imagine you walk the line, right, from beginning to end. Well, at a certain point, then at each point of the line, then at some time was at one point behind you, where you were, and in front of you. Well, on the same view of McTaggart, on McTaggart's view, that that's absurd. It couldn't be that each point of the line has each of these three properties, right? Being behind, being where you are, and being in front of you, right? Well, and the obvious answer here is because, time, because at different times they have different properties. But the idea here is supposed to be akin to the spatial analogy, right? Each of these things, the parts of the line, whether or not it's behind you, whether or not it's where you're standing, whether or not it's in front of you, only makes sense with respect to taking into consideration the whole line and where you are on the line. Right. And so the thought here is supposed to be something like that. Like, well, okay, maybe we can understand time in the same way. We don't have to understand time in terms of, we can understand these events as past, present, and future. But we don't understand the past as, this event happened before this event and this other event. No, what we do is we understand the past in terms of what time is present and the entire, block of time, the whole period of time that exists. here's if we think about that, maybe we can understand. Um, uh, maybe we can respond to McTaggart in certain ways and say, look, um, no, actually, your eighth series of time misunderstands what we need to understand how time works. So here are some, kind of attempts to come up with this way of thinking about time, even within the A theory. So here's a view called presentism. So presentism is the idea that actually it's not the case, so now we move into thinking about the existence of events. On the presentist view, we ask the question, do all events exist? That is, so like, think about you once were born, and you will at some point die. At some point your grandmother was born in the past. At some point your grandmother died or will die. These are events that have happened. But question: do those events exist? Especially the ones in the past, right? So like, does does your birth exist? Well, on the presentist view, the thought is no. Like that stopped existing. That stopped existing after the moment it stopped being that moment, right? In fact, according to the presentist view, the moment that just passed no longer exists. The only moment that exists is now. Just the present moment. Just the present moment exists. And so really, for when it comes to time, there's only ever the present moment. And what it means to say that, what it means to say that something is in the past, is to say that it once existed as the present, but then it stopped existing. And to say that something will be in the future is to say that it will eventually be the present, but that it hasn't yet been the present, right? It doesn't exist yet, but it will come into existence when it becomes the present moment. So presentism is this idea that really we ought to privilege the present. We ought to privilege the present, and we got to understand all of time in terms of privileging the present moment. If we privilege the present moment, then we won't have to do this song and dance about, complaining about how it is that a past moment can be both future, present, and past, right? Because if we privilege the present moment, then we can understand all moments in terms of how they relate to the present moment. And that doesn't really make, each of these things into a B series view either. It's not that we're now somehow reducing all times to their relations to other times. It's just that the present moment is this special moment. It's got this property of being the present. And, past moments have the property of being the past. And the answer as to why those moments have the property of being in the past, it has to do with the fact that they ceased to exist. And that's partly in relation to, they're not being the present moment anymore, but that's just some sort of, accident of how they are. It's not because of their relation to the present moment that they are in the past. It's that they no longer exist and that they once existed. Similarly, with events in the future, do not yet exist, and it will at some point come to exist. So it's not really their relationship that those points stand into the present moment that makes them in the future, as the B series would say. Instead, it's just the fact that they do not exist but will eventually come to exist. So that's a presentist view. That's one way that people have thought, well, okay, maybe we can understand past, present, and future along these lines. Another way, and I think, these start to get much more elaborate and much more interesting, but kind of wild and funny in certain ways, is to think of time as either growing or shrinking. So again, we return to this question of, well, okay, what do all events exist? And you might think, No, right? But then you might think, well, certain events exist. Like, at one point there were dinosaurs, and so the dinosaurs existed, and so there's it does exist. That there's a time that exists where the dinosaurs existed. On that view, you might think like you might privilege the past in some way. You might think, okay, look, um, the times in the past existed, and so in a sense, in a timeless sense, they always exist. It makes sense to talk about the past. We can always talk about the past, um, and so the present moment is sort of everything that exists up to now, right? So we've got this kind of like, the Big Bang happens, and then all this stuff goes on, and we can think about it in terms of like a block in some way, and then at the very top of the block, there's this new layer that's being laid at every possible moment, this new layer of things moving through space or something like that. And so we can think of what we might think of as the growing timeline or the growing block theory of the universe, where everything is just kind of, as more stuff happens, things get added to the block. And everything that, consists in the block that's not at the top of the block is the past. But all that stuff exists. All those events happened, and all those things, and so then now what it means to say that some event is past is to say, well, that it exists, but it's not at the top of the block, right? And what it is to say that some event is in the future is to say, well, okay, it doesn't exist yet, but it will eventually be a state at the top of the block of all of time, and then eventually that will go into the. Now, you can also, though, one of the sort of funny issues with this kind of view is that you can just do the reverse also, in thinking about it. You don't have to think of time as this growing block where all of the past, it continues to exist. In a sense, it just starts being past, right? Whereas, well, while the future doesn't exist yet, um, instead, you can think of what's called the shrinking block view, which on the shrinking block view, the thought is, well, look, because of at the Big Bang, everything was kind of determined in some way. All of time was laid out for us, or something like that. So all of the future exists in some sense, and as time goes on, the block of time slowly shrinks. So basically the idea is the present moment is at the bottom of the block, and slowly the block is moving up, as time is going on, and once a moment passes, it ceases to exist, right? So there's all of these potential things that could happen in the future, and those all kind of exist. They exist right now, in the future. But all of the things, when you make a decision and it cuts off a possibility for your life, once the moment's passed, that moment ceases to exist. It no longer is. And so, on this other view of how things are, we've got the shrinking block version of the universe, in which as time goes on, things get, in a sense, smaller and smaller, but the present moment is the bottom of the block as it shifts up. Another view just kind of goes back to, in a way, rejecting the A series and in favor of the B series. And the B series, basically, well, if you thought we're thinking about these sort of the growing block and the shrinking block view of time, you might have thought like, well, wait, why are we thinking about a block? Why is it shrinking and why is it growing? Why don't we just think of all of time as existing? And for this, you get this view called eternalism. And basically, eternalism is interesting because, for the most part, eternalism is just a version of the B series. Eternalism says, well, look, when it comes to like tenselessly talking about time, um, all of time exists. All of time exists, and based there's just events in time, and time, those events occur at different times, and the relationship between them is such that there's earlier times and later times, and events occur at these different times. And again, I mean, like some people, eternalists will just bite the bullet in a sense and say, well, yeah, okay, so um, uh, the problem that McTaggart had with the B theory is that it can't account for change. And they'll say something like, well, yeah, but that doesn't matter, right? Like change is something that doesn't matter to time. Change happens within time, within the universe in a way, but that doesn't mean that all these times don't already exist in some tenseless sense. And time, change is just the relationships between events, how one event turns into another throughout time. So you get these kinds of pictures, right? So and finally, the last theory I'll talk about is kind of this hybrid. On the pure theory, the pure A theory, you get this, now, right? Now is just the only time that there is, and there's nothing that exists before it or after it. Everything is just moving as things are now. Um, uh, the pure B theory just takes all of time eternally existing, right? From the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe. There's just how the universe is. There's no privileged now time, and so there's just things that are before and things that are after. But then there are these hybrid theories, right? So there's this, here's the growing block view, or you could also think of it as the shrinking block view, depending on what direction the now is going. And on this view, in a sense, yeah, like okay, so it kind of works like the A theory in that there's a privileged time now that we ought to understand everything in terms of. But then other things exist too, like in this case, if the arrow is, now is growing, then the past still exists, and that's what's in the cone. Or if the arrow that now if time is shrinking, then the future exists, and the future is in the cone. What about this other view, though? This other view that takes all of time to exist, and then now to be in some sense a privileged middle ground. Well, could we have both an A and a B series kind of together? Couldn't they be consistently taken together? And there is a view that sort of buys into this, and it's often called the moving spotlight view. And I think it's sort of plausible. On this view, we take both the A and the B series, and we admit that all of time exists in some sense, eternally. There's just this, big block of time. Whatever time is, it's just a big block of time. And all of time exists, and all of the events stand in relation to one another. But there's also these other features of time. And the other features of time are that time, that there's a temporal movement, there's a time, there's a direction of time that makes it the case that T1 is before T2 and T2 is before T3, rather than, the other way around. But then there's also something special about the present. It's like as if God had a spotlight, right? As if, like, imagine God had a spotlight and he's looking at this big block of the universe, and he's shining the spotlight at the specific moment that's current. And he's kind of like, going from one side of the block to the other with the spotlight. And on this view, we can understand how the past, the present, and the future work without denying that any of these things exist. We don't have to say that the past doesn't exist. We don't have to say that the future doesn't exist. We can understand tense on this view by saying, oh, well, the reason that now is because, even though the future exists and the past exists, there's a special property of now, that the spotlight has hit this moment right now, right? And the reason that past times are past is because they were in the spotlight, but they no longer are, even though they and they still exist. And similarly with the future, the times that are in the future will be in the spotlight, but they haven't yet come to be in the spotlight. And so once they're in the spotlight, then they'll be present. But for now, they're in the future. Finally, sort of the last thing that's worth thinking about amongst these views is whether or not the B series alone could work. Could it really be that change is an illusion? Um, Maybe everything does already exist, and change really isn't part of what time is at all. But it's not entirely clear what that would be, right? So if you're kind of like fatalist, if you think that fate, everything is fated and nothing is really going to change, and you also think or maybe like you agree with Kant or something, that time is just at how we perceive time is just this way that our mind tries to filter the information that it gets from the world. If you think that that's what time is, maybe the B series could work by itself. But it's really interesting to think about whether or not the nature of things changing is actually tied up with what time is itself. And it seems at the very least that they're very closely related. And if they're very closely related, I think it's, at least in some ways, a better bet to go with the more complicated theories that accept both A and B intuitions. That accepting both that there is a present and that the present is somehow privileged, and that helps us understand how things change over time. All right. That sort of ends this primer on theories of time. Since we haven't really talked about, a lot of each of these theories in a lot of detail, I just wanted to give you all a kind of view into how you might think about them. Next time, though, we're going to talk about persistence over time. In particular, objects' persistence over time. Going back to the ship of Theseus example, and one solution to the ship of Theseus example is this view called the worm theory, and I think it's interesting and fun and worth talking about. So we're going to try to get there and hopefully use more nice little graphics like this to help understand these things, because thinking about time in visual terms, it's sort of helpful. It's also sort of unhelpful. That's why I haven't used as many visual analogies, like spatial analogies, so far this lecture. But I hope that you have at least come to think a little bit more about time, and that it will help you in the future.